history has these quirks to it that have made us actually more vulnerable to other democracies. So just a kind of one note on this, that so in 2016, there's this organization called Freedom House, which ranks democracies around the world on a scale of 0 to 100. Back in 2016, or even a decade ago, we had a score of 93 out of 100, which put us on par with Germany, Canada, Great Britain, the usual kind of suspects. Today we have a score of 84, which puts us with the same score as Romania and 2 points lower than Argentina. And so, something's gone amiss, and that's what we're trying to figure out, what's gone wrong.
Professor, I think it's hard to believe that when a bunch of landed white Protestant men were drafting a document 250 years ago, they could have possibly gotten something not perfect for 250 years later. But assuming that assumption might be true, walk us through what some of those imperfections in said constitution might be.
Yeah, so it's absolutely right. It's a very old constitution. In fact, the world's oldest written constitution that's still in place. And so it was written in a pre-democratic era. I mean, it was written before people thought that democracy was a thing that they were trying to achieve. And many features of our Constitution, which in retrospect we kind of imbue with this far-sighted vision that there was a blueprint to establish this republic, and in retrospect we've attached a lot of values to things that were actually the result of compromise and concession at the founding. And so just to give you one example, I mean the most obvious example that's probably in all of our minds, given that it's a presidential election year, is the Electoral College. So, we're the only democracy today in the world with an Electoral College for selecting our president. Other democracies used to have electoral colleges, but slowly over time, over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, they got rid of their electoral colleges. Argentina was the last democracy in 1994. So, why did we end up with this? I mean, there's lots of reasons we might say that there's a value to the Electoral College. It allows for small states and rural states to be represented, and one could say, well, you often hear people say, well, candidates won't campaign in small states if we didn't have an Electoral College. These are all retrospective kind of justifications. The reality of it, the story, is that this is a new republic that back in the 18th century. This is a totally new experiment. How do you have an executive who's not a king? There's no large polity in the world that had done this. And so the founders were really flummoxed by this, and initially James Madison came in, the author in many ways of large elements of our Constitution, as well as the Federalist Papers. His idea was that the Congress should pick the president. That was voted down. Others said there should be a direct election for the president. And they couldn't really decide, so they said, okay, we're going to put this issue off, and they assigned it to a committee called the Committee of Unfinished Parts, which were the most difficult features of the Constitution. And at the very end of the convention, they came up with this kind of third best solution, which was the Electoral College. So we have this system today, just to take that as an example, which was sort of there by kind of accident in some level. I mean, it was trying to deal with a real problem, but that problem is that our society has dramatically transformed, as you say, and so
women can vote too.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Another feature of our political system has changed. So the Electoral College, there's other things that. So we have this very old Constitution. I mean, one thing that's actually quite striking to a lot of people is that the U.S. Constitution, as it was originally written, doesn't use the word equality. And so it kind of, the Declaration of Independence does, but over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, many citizens in the United States have worked really hard to make our Constitution more democratic, to improve it. And so there have been incredible achievements. I mean, there's the original Constitution, we had the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed political equality and birthright citizenship. The passage of the 17th Amendment to allow for the direct election of U.S. senators at the beginning of the 20th century, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. All of these things were improvements on our Constitution that have made the things that we all love about our Constitution, many of these things came about through improvement. And so that's sort of one of our points, and one of the discoveries in the book is that this is not something, we often say we're the oldest democracy in the world. We've become more democratic over time through lots of hard work.
So I love that. I love that definition of an identification of some of those challenges. I remember having a conversation with David Hogg, the gun violence hero of an anti-gun violence movement, and when he was a student here at Harvard, and he asked me, here's the language we're thinking of for this bill, and if not after Parkland, if not after Sandy Hook, if not after the next one, and the next one, and the next one. What tweaks can you make? Is it, David, it's not a gun violence issue, it's a democracy issue, right? It's the calcification of these inequities in a democratic system that you need to fix, right? It's 60 requirements of 60 senators to pass a bill through the US Senate that isn't financial related, which last time I checked also is not in the Constitution. So you've helped define that those challenges, and this document that should be celebrated, but has been improved multiple times over these nearly 250 years. But these structures also then reinforce the ability of a minority to essentially govern a majority. Is that?
Yeah, so we're the only democracy in the world in which one can lose an election and become president. So you could lose the majority of the vote and become president. And that's only the sort of tip of the iceberg, as you're saying. I mean, of course, we have the US Senate, where you have 2 senators per state. And back at the founding, Delaware was the small state, Virginia was the big state, and essentially what it meant was that the voters of Delaware had 17 times more power than the voters of Virginia. Today, the smallest state is Wyoming with 500,000 citizens, California with 30 million citizens, and so it's like 70 times. So this disparity has only grown. So again, in the Senate, it's very common. Actually, in the 21st century, the Democratic Party has, if you count up the number of votes for the senators, Democratic Party, the senators sitting in the Democratic senators sitting in the Senate represent more than a majority of Americans the entire 21st century, and yet Republicans have controlled the Senate for half the time. So again, that's an institution that's tilted in favor of the political minority. You add to that then the third institution you just mentioned, the filibuster, which isn't in the Constitution, which really only came into frequent usage at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. It's so that every bill has to have this supermajority to get passed. We're the only democracy in the world with such a kind of obstructionist tool. And then I would add to that the kind of fourth domain where minorities have outsized political power, political minorities have outsized political power, is in the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court, all countries have, most democracies have independent judiciaries. People, you don't want the court to be kind of the sort of follow the whims of majorities. There's a purpose for the court to kind of settle disputes, protect minority rights. But we have a distinctive feature in our Constitution of lifetime appointment for Supreme Court justices, or national judiciary. And we're the only democracy in the world that has that particular feature. And so what that means, we use the cumbersome phrase of intergenerational counter-majoritarianism, too many syllables. But what that essentially means is that a justice appointed a generation ago can still make decisions about somebody who's just coming of age right now. Why is somebody who was appointed 34 years ago overruling the will of majorities today? And so there's a whole set of very specific policies. I mean, these are all kind of abstract debates, but you mentioned gun control. There's overwhelming majorities of Americans who want more aggressive gun control, gun regulation. Majorities of Americans in favor of reproductive rights. There's majorities of Americans, if you believe opinion polls, in favor of more aggressive efforts to deal with income inequality and poverty. Immigration as well. The minimum wage is something that overwhelming majority raising the minimum wage. But all of these policy areas, we see that there's a kind of our voters, what our policies are and what voters want are out of sync. And there's lots of reasons for that. But one contributing factor is certainly these institutions that are tilted in favor of a political minority. I just want to emphasize here that this easily can sound like a partisan story. And sometimes people will say, well, this is convenient because the Democrats keep losing the Electoral College. But it's not partisan to say that the person with the most votes should win an election. That's a basic kind of democratic principle.
One would think. I wanted to build upon something that you had mentioned, because I think it oftentimes gets overlooked, that when the electoral structures are such that you have to win 60 votes in order to pass sweeping legislation, it then also creates an incentive to say, when you have these opportunities, you go as far as you can, because you're not necessarily going to have another opportunity to address that issue again. So you're not going to be able to, it incentivizes sweeping policy reform to the extent of you get what you can get when you can get it, rather than a kind of good faith effort on incrementalism to say, hey, we can address this now, and if we can't get all of it, I know that we can get through this next election and take the next stab at it, and then take the next stab at it, and take the next stab at it, because what we're seeing of late is characterized by our bodies in Congress is essentially with divided government, you can't do much other than pass funding bills, and then you wait till one side has a unified control of the House, Senate, and presidency and moves as far as they can one direction, and then the pendulum swings back and they move as far as they can the other way, which makes the art of governance harder and harder, which actually was one of my frustrations in office of saying, you've got a governing structure that is exploited by a party that is now more and more defined as anti-government, that is trying to break it rather than fix it, and then point to it and say, it's broken, which, yeah, because you broke it.
Yeah, no, I think it raises the stakes. I mean, so it's very easy as a political scientist to have abstract debates about what is democracy, is democracy under threat, and so on. But one of the points that I really think is essential is to think that democracy matters because it affects people's lives. It delivers to citizens what they want. Citizens can take issues into their own hands, and if you have a democracy in which majorities are constantly thwarted, it generates all sorts of resentments, grievance, understandable, and disaffection. And so you add to that then this point that it kind of raises the stakes of politics. And another example to kind of amplify that point you just made is, with the lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices, what this means is that when you appoint somebody Supreme Court justice, they're gonna serve a long time. And so this raises the stakes of those Senate hearings when they have these discussions.
And lowers their age.
Right, and lowers their age, right, exactly. And people live longer and so on. And so the idea is, you never know if you're a president, you never know when you're going to get a chance to nominate somebody. And then when you have that moment, you're going to put this person in. And that kind of contentious, ugly politics that we see over at Senate is a result of the same kind of dynamic. And so, I think there's ways of addressing that.
So, I'm glad you mentioned there might be ways of addressing that. I'd be curious if you happen to have a place where you happen to address what some of those solutions might be. Walk us through what some of them could be.
Yeah, so that, as I said at the beginning, that was really the purpose of the book, was to kind of come up with a set of ideas, drawing on the experiences of other countries, drawing on our own history. And so the last chapter of the book, we have a list of 15 proposals that we discuss for how to democratize our democracy. That's the name of the chapter.
So, as we were talking beforehand, some might criticize, though I actually heard somebody in the crowd say good luck, as we mentioned those at one point, or referenced those at one point. So there is that academic debate, and we would have, I was engaged in plenty of those when I was in office. The question then would come like, okay, fine, how do we get there? How do we do that? So what advice, if you were to talk to an aspiring members of Congress that might be in this room with us tonight, what advice would you give them about where do we start?
So, maybe I'll list some of the items first. As we say, there's no other democracy in the world than electoral college, and so people are freaked out that if we get rid of electoral college, civil war will break out. But it seems like every other democracy has managed to get rid of electoral college. So that's on our list. Eliminate the electoral college. Another kind of item on the list is guarantee voting rights. Actually, the U.S. Constitution doesn't actually guarantee voting rights. That sort of comes as news to a lot of people. The 13th Amendment says you can't, or 15th Amendment says you can't restrict voting rights on the basis of previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment says you can't take away voting rights on the basis of gender. So there's sort of definitions of under what conditions it can't be taken away, but there's no positive statement of a right to vote. So that's another proposal that we say, that it should be a right to vote. There should be a whole series of reforms to make it easier to vote, automatic voter registration, make election day a holiday, as most democracies do. We also call for term limits on justices. I haven't gotten to the realism question yet, I understand, but I have to first lay out the terrain here. Term limits for justices. We also called for, and this is pretty controversial, I think, the elimination of the filibuster, or at least the weakening of the filibuster. If my co-author were here, he would say the elimination of the filibuster. I say the elimination of it, or the weakening of it. So, but in any case, it's clearly a problem. We're the only democracy with it. And again, the thing about the filibuster is that many Democrats are rightfully worried. Trump gets elected president. And the Republicans have control of the Senate. Maybe they will attempt to pass a national abortion ban. And then, here I am saying we should get rid of the filibuster, which may be the only thing protecting us. So getting rid of the filibuster is quite a proposition. But again, we're the only democracy in the world without this. So how is it that other societies have managed to kind of get through this? So I could go on, but in terms of what's realistic, some of these proposals require constitutional amendment, and some of these proposals just require legislation. Eliminating the filibuster or weakening of the filibuster, which has already begun to happen in many instances, and is something that the Senate can just decide upon. It's a Senate rule. It's not even it's not in the Constitution. Despite you often will hear, there was in 2022 there was a debate over eliminating the filibuster to pass a voting rights reform. And you had U.S. senators saying, well, the founding fathers wanted a filibuster, which is a complete myth. And you read the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton warns precisely against supermajority rules because he knew that it created lots of problems. So I think that's a place to start, to get to your question, the weakening of the filibuster as well as voting rights.
So I agree, but I want to push you on a little bit here because I think the reforms that you lay out in the book, and for those of you that haven't had a chance to read it yet, the way that you start the discussion about the aspirations that I felt anyway, and I presume was shared in this room on January 5th, 2021, when we watched the first Black senator and Jewish senator get elected in Georgia, and what that was going to mean for our democracy, and how proud I was to see that, and how horrified to see what took place the next day, and the juxtaposition thereof. And then, as we walk through these chapters, just the eeriness as you discuss what happens in Thailand, in India, in Peru, and other places of saying, ripped from the headlines today, here. But we are also a country in the midst of massive economic and demographic change. The defining characteristic now of partisanship is education, right? Not class. The extraordinary rural-urban migration that is taking place and has been taking place over the course of the past several decades. That if you were one of my former Republican colleagues now, you'd say, okay, great, all the reforms you just talked about accentuate and prioritize and consolidate the power of the political power in major blue urban centers across the country, whether that's New York or Boston or St. Louis, or what would happen in Cheyenne or Jackson, Wyoming, rather than the rest of Wyoming. And that does prejudice the large swaths of the country that not a whole lot of people live in, but they've got just as much right to this as we do, and their way of life is going to change dramatically and quickly if we don't look out for them. So are there reforms that you articulated there that actually accentuate the ability and opportunity for a party that is now resonates deeply with a highly urbanized base to actually get beyond that base and perhaps spend a little bit more attention in places that oftentimes we might fly over rather than visit?
Yeah, so, I want to be really clear about this. I'm a small d Democrat. I'm somebody who's particularly interested in democracy, not the Democratic Party. The fate of the Democratic Party is not as crucial to how I think about these issues. Democracy is the purpose here. And so, democracy is a kind of form of government that is based on really three basic pillars. One, participation, broad participation, people have the right to vote, right to run for office. Competition, there needs to be genuine competition. When the incumbent goes to sleep at night, the night before an election, he or she, shouldn't be able to sleep very well because there should be very closely fought elections. That's essential for democracy. And the third pillar is basic civil liberties and civil rights. Now, the proposals we have in this book are intended to promote competition because the problem in our current arrangement is that we have a tilted playing field. I think, to me, the ideal moment, that the sign that our democracy would be in flourishing in some way, and this is that not only do you have a multi-ethnic Democratic Party, but you have a multi-ethnic Republican Party that may be conservative and disagree with the Democratic Party on key issues, but we should have two political parties that can compete on an open playing field where the party that wins the most votes wins. And currently we have a system in which we have this kind of uneven, distorted playing field. Unintended, the Republican Party didn't create this. This is, again, kind of an accident of history. And the driving force, I mean, just to give the kind of very brief history of how we ended up with this, we have a system that was designed before there was a Republican Party that was always essentially overrepresented rural areas. Over the course of the 1990s and into the beginning of the 21st century, until that point, it wasn't a problem because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party did well in both urban and rural areas. But what transformed in our society is that urban areas became the party of Democratic Party became the party of urban areas, the Republican Party became the party of rural areas for all sorts of reasons. And so these institutions that previously just benefited the Republican Party didn't have a partisan edge to them, now have this partisan edge. So now we see that the system was unfair, that you can very often lose election even though you lose power even if you've lost an election. So what we're calling for really is just an equalization of the playing field. And I think this would actually, I think this would provide help to the Republican Party. Because if the Republican Party actually had to win majorities to win power, the kind of temptation to double down on white nationalism would not be there. And so, the thing is, if you think you can win a national election winning, 46% of the vote, which is what Trump's number was in 2016, you don't have to appeal to a broad swath of Americans. You had a national election. So, I think there's a problem in red states and in blue states of insufficient competition. And so that's part of what you're pointing to. But also at the national level, there's insufficient, the playing field's tilted in a way. And so, one of the other proposals we have is we argue for the introduction of electoral reform, such as ranked choice voting, proportional systems of voting, to kind of open up the playing field. I mean, the genius of democracy in a way is that it's self-correcting. Unlike an authoritarian system, where the message doesn't get back to the leader. Democracy, if you lose an election, you've screwed up. Okay, and so you have to rethink your strategy, right? You have to think, and you spend a lot of time thinking about it, right? So, but that's great because that's what democracy does. That's how a democracy improves, and that's how you address people's lives. So, if you have a system that's tilted and creates a system of unfair competition, and you keep winning, you're not going to rethink you're not going to rethink. So, I mean, put it more concretely. So Donald Trump lost the popular vote for the presidency in 2016.
No way. You should tell him.
Yeah. He lost the popular vote for the presidency in 2020. And if we didn't have an electoral college, do we really think that he would be once again the candidate for president a third time after having lost twice? And so, by injecting more free and fair competition, I think there's a kind of corrective measures that can be sent to the beneficiaries of these unfair systems.
Didn't you win California?
What's that?
I said, didn't you win California?
Yeah, no.
You won California. There's another book to be written about why he's the nominee this time around too, which is a topic for another day. But it does obviously get to a number of the incentives, structural incentives that you put in play, that you put here that I think most elected officials on not just January 7th, but in the weeks thereafter, never thought that he could possibly be a nominee for president again. And yet, here we are. And you touch upon this actually very early on in the book, because you talk about the decline of social standing and how the erosion of essentially political norms, but the decline of social standing and the increased stakes of these elections lead to a circumstance where a lot of that political enthusiasm isn't so much for your chosen candidate, but fear of stopping the other, right? So what drives the support for Donald Trump, for 30% of the electorate, it might be that they love Donald Trump. For another slice of it, it's that they actually don't want a Democrat to win. And some of that 30%, it's that same thing. So talk to me a little bit about, is that fear of the other and fear of the other one winning, is that also uniquely American? Or has that been a motivating factor that you've seen? I think you actually touched upon this when you discussed Thailand, but how can we get beyond that? Because that is actually a choice that to some extent each of us can do, where you say, look, unless you're elected to the Senate, there's not a whole lot you can do to end the filibuster. But what can a community like Brookline do to try to ease the fear of a fellow American running for office and winning an election and the consequence of it?
Yeah, so we really take this up a lot in our previous book, How Democracies Die, where we talk about this a norm that we call mutual toleration, which is essentially the idea that you accept your competitors as just as rivals, and you may not privately particularly like them, but at least publicly you accept them, that they have a right to compete for office, and if they beat you, they have a right to govern. And democracy requires that. And polarization, which is what you're describing, undermines that. And so it makes a democracy more vulnerable. But polarization at some levels also can be a good thing in the sense that you want to have choices in democracy. It's okay if parties differ from each other, but it's this kind of animosity and fear and hatred that is so frightening. And I think one of the things that happens is that if you fear that you're going to lose, in particular, and not only lose an election, but lose your way of life, then it compels, and this we provide accounts of this, as you mentioned, Thailand and other places throughout history, of people turning away, parties and politicians turning away from democracy. And so when I began with the beginning of our conversation, I said that one of our parties is acting in a non-democratic fashion or something like that. That's a serious accusation to level at a political party, right? So to say that a party is not democratic sounds like it's almost violating that norm. But one of the goals in this book was really to try to lay out a set of criteria by which we can decide whether a party is acting as an anti-democratic political party. And this is really important now, I think, especially when the debate has reached a level where both sides are accusing each other of being a threat to democracy. And so I think citizens have to be able to be aware of what kind of behaviors are simply beyond the pale and unacceptable in a democracy and count as an authoritarian. So in the book we lay out two very simple criteria. I mean, it's so simple that it's hard to believe, but it's actually critical, I think. And we draw here on a great Spanish political scientist named Juan Linz, who wrote back in the 1970s, long before Donald Trump. So the criteria weren't developed, to make sense of Trump. But the two criteria simply, he says, in order to be a political party, a politician that's loyal to democracy, you have to accept election results, win or lose. Number two, you have to not use violence or threaten violence to try to gain power, to hold on to power. If you violate either of those rules, you're an anti-democratic force. And so we can use those criteria. And then we add to that a third criteria, which is a little more nuanced, which is essentially the idea that if you're a party or a politician committed to democracy, no matter what you think of the other side, you have to, if people violate those first two rules, and they're in your own camp, you have to condemn them publicly, explicitly, repeatedly. You have to expel them from your party. You have to sever all ties with them. And political parties and politicians that don't do that are contributing to democratic crisis. And sometimes it's it's hard to recognize, because it's clear somebody who endorses violence or doesn't accept election results, we kind of know these are the people charging the Congress building. But the people who tolerate that kind of behavior in their own midst, these are people often wearing suits and ties. They're sitting in the Congress building. They look like normal politicians. They're acting like they're trying to get ahead. It's a normal thing that happens in a democracy. And people should be ambitious. But when you let your ambition blind you to violations in your own camp, that's very, very dangerous. And the point of drawing on these other experiences, because the book's not just about the U.S., is to say in other democracies in the 1930s in Europe, 1960s and 70s in Latin America, democracies really get into trouble not only when people attack the parliament building, it's when the mainstream politicians, who are essentially the kind of less visible accomplices, those are the ones who ultimately get democracy.
So much in there. I mean, when I read part of that passage, I immediately thought back to Dr. King, right, and the challenge that civil rights confronted of the white monarch, right, and the silence, right, of just not now, it's uncomfortable, wait longer. I will tell you, I've still got a lot of friends
I
in.
can't hear you. Can you guys speak up a little bit?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
No problem.
I'm trying really hard.
Sorry, no, I'm glad you said something. So I've still got a lot of friends that are members in both sides of the aisle, both sides of the chambers in Washington, and somebody that I'd served with for years, Republican, who to this day, when it's just him and me, and I say, who won the election in 2020? Who won? The response is Joe Biden's our president. See, yeah, but I know Joe Biden's our president. Who won the election? Joe Biden's our president. And he'll smile, he'll laugh, he'll giggle, but he still, even just with me, will not say it. And one of the challenges I wrestle with is how is somebody that for the functioning of the body, right? Republicans are in charge. You want to pass a bill, you need them to sign on. You need people on the other side to be able to move legislation forward, particularly when you're not in power. How do you work with them when there's also an essential truth that they will not acknowledge? And do you then just say, okay, fine, I'm not gonna try to pass legislation with you, because there's constituents of mine that are suffering whose lives would be meaningfully better if we could address this. So am I gonna punish them by not working with you because you can't acknowledge the outcome of an election? Like, but if I work with you, am I condoning your behavior? So talk to a recovering member of Congress.
Yeah, no, that's very difficult dilemma. That one of the things that we really emphasize is the importance of condemning this kind of behavior when it's in your own camp, because that has so much power.
And what
it's
Kinzinger,
kind of self-policing.
what Adam Kinzinger did, and Liz Cheney, and I don't think, forgive me for a second, I don't think most folks understand, when you have gone through what it takes to win an election, and you work in a body where everybody calls you sir and ma'am, that you are prioritized and idolized, right? And the entire mechanism is predicated around you being able to lead a staff, and when you're a member of Congress, there's elevators that are reserved for you. You define yourself that way, to have them give that up, knowing that they were going to give that up, was an extraordinary act of patriotism, right? For which they've been celebrated, but it's not like they just gave up their job. It was far more than that they sacrificed. So.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And we point to two examples in history that we can learn from. So in 1934, February 6, 1934, there was an attack on the French Parliament in Paris as a vote was taking place for the French Prime Minister. So counting up of the ballots for the leader is a bad time, right? Because there was an attack on the Congress by a group of militants, veterans, people who were armed. The police beat them back. People were injured and killed. But it turned out afterwards that many of the conservative members of the parliament knew this attack was coming. And so this was a moment where then an investigation was launched, but rather than having a kind of uniform condemnation of this attack on the parliament, the parliament was divided. The right basically said these guys were the heroes, the police officers were the criminals. The liberals and the radicals and the Republicans, the kind of center and center left, said this was an attack on the French Republic, and they had these parallel histories for the next 6 years. And by the time you get to 1939, 1940, the French right's slogan was better Hitler than Blue, with reference to the socialist prime minister. They're saying French nationalists were rooting for Hitler over a socialist in their own parliament. And so the inability to kind of deal with that kind of event in 1934 helped give rise to this polarization that you're talking about. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. In
Talk about the lynch.
So Spain, 1981, another attack on the parliament. Madrid. If you go to Madrid today and get a tour of the Spanish parliament, there's bullet holes in the ceiling of the parliament because there was an attempted coup. This was several years after the Spanish transition to democracy. These armed guys came into the building as the parliament was in session. You can actually find this on YouTube. You can see the video of this because there was a live camera, so an early version of C-SPAN in Spain recorded this event. For about 24 hours, there was a similar kind of crisis. But within a day, the right, the center, and the socialist left marched in the streets of Madrid saying this is unacceptable, this is an attack on our new democracy, and we're not going to accept it. And Spanish democracy has been stable ever since.
And I think you highlight three guys in that room.
Yes.
I mean, it's a gripping recitation of what happened, but three guys, one of whom just keeps smoking a cigarette.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Doesn't flinch.
Yeah.
Yes. But it's extraordinary, where the act of three people helped save democracy.
Yeah. Right. And so, it was certainly lonely for Adam Kinzinger and Liz and Cheney, still is. But I think one of the other things we have to remember is that after January 6th, there was this kind of moment of unity, and there was people saying they're not going to give money to elected people with money, saying we're not going to donate money to election deniers and so on. But this lasted very briefly. And the thing that frightened me, as I watched those events, knowing about the February 6th event, and then as the events unfolded over the next year, and hearing this kind of parallel history, this kind of alternative history, that it resonates much more with what happened in France in 1934 than Spain in 1980.
Last question from me, and then we're going to open it up here. You're a little d Democrat, big D Democrat, and little d Democrat, both. We are family friendly, so we are going to say that there's a bright light that shines over the Capitol on January 21st, 2025. What is the first thing that President Kamala Harris should do when she gets behind the rest of the desk?
And she was asked this recently, didn't have a very good answer for it.
Or in case she's watching now.
Yeah. So, I think in terms of defending our democracy, there's actually two bills that are already in the Congress that are ready to go. HR 1, House Resolution 1, and HR 4, House Resolution 4. And these were proposed back in 2022. And if the Democrat, this is conditional on Democrats taking the House and the Senate. These are bills, voting rights bill. One is named the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The other is the Freedom to Vote Act. And both of these are about defending democracy. And I encourage everybody to go look at those bills because it's kind of shocking. There's efforts to deal with campaign finance. There's efforts to deal with gerrymandering. Like every pet issue that you think is wrong with our democracy with regards to voting.
It's almost as if they asked you what they should do before they wrote it.
Right. Yeah. And so these are and lots of efforts to make it easier to vote. Most democracies in the world do everything they can to make it easy to vote. We don't do that for some reason, and so in those bills, those are things.
And that's not just a big R Republican thing.
No, that's right.
The Democratic Party doesn't always make it.
Right, and so it varies from state to state. You have automatic voter registration in some states, not others, blue states and red states. So those are certainly at the top of my list as an advocate of democracy. I should say that when Joe Biden came in, I think there was a sort of two paths he could go. One was to address the underlying economic conditions facing our country at that moment, and I think the bet was a kind of bet, which was that if we improve the economy, if we deal with the COVID crisis, this will take out some of the rage behind the populism that we're facing and this kind of dynamic of polarization that we're facing. And I think that's a pretty good proposition. And that was the bet. And we'll see if it works, right? But I think the other path he could have gone, which he didn't pursue, was to carry out these kind of democratic reforms. And I think in retrospect that probably made sense. But for we can get through November 2024. But for the long term, we're going to be back in this situation in 4 years, even in the best of circumstances, unless we address the underlying ailments in our system. And I think some of these have to do with these core institutional features of our democracy.
I'm not sure he had the votes in the Senate to do some of the things that you might under option B, but I digress. Questions from the audience, because you've heard enough from me. Sir?
So, I have a comment and I have a question. One thing, I think you've missed this completely. And that is that, the real issue is that people are disengaged from the process. And so, if you look around in Georgia and around the country, voting is easier. You've got 2 weeks of early voting, mail-in voting, and all that. So we keep blaming those issues. When the fact of the matter is, most people don't see the importance of government. They don't see the importance, and the politicians, they're elitists. They're prima donnas. The fact that if you go into Congress, they have their separate elevators. They never go into their districts on a continual basis. You only see them there when there's an election. And you probably don't even see them then at that point. So people don't see them there. So you don't have the Paul Wellstones or the Metzenbaums and those players out there who are connecting to the people, and then they blame the other issues out there. So my question is, do you see politicians these days as very different than the politicians in the past that I believe were much more connected to their constituents and were out there actually engaging with people? Because those politicians, they don't even want to talk to their constituents on an ongoing basis.
Yes. So I'd love to.
There are some exceptions.
I'd love to hear what Joe thinks about this as well. But
Apparently not. So
One thing I'll say though is, I mean, I agree with you. I agree. I mean, there's sort of two different elements though to your question. One is that government's not responding to what people want, and so they become disengaged. But there's a reason that's the case, and that's part of what we're trying to get at, is that if government just keeps not reflecting the will of the majority, it's very understandable that you become disengaged. But I think to your point about not seeing politicians, I mean, one of our proposals is to expand the size of the House of Representatives. And so, in the US, until the 1920s, every 10 years, the House of Representatives was expanded. This was a normal procedure. And another way to put it is to shrink, in the past, congressional districts were much smaller. They've been frozen, and this is not a constitutional issue, this is simply a legislative issue. The House can change its size. Until the 19th, so every 10 years after a census, it was expanded. Until the 1920s, and at that point it's been frozen. It's been frozen at that same size ever since. As our population has expanded massively over the last century, and so our congressional districts are much bigger. Now, I'm not suggesting we have a Congress of a House of Representatives of 1,000 representatives or something, but the average size is 500,000 or so voters per district. That's good. We could make these districts smaller, which would mean that you'd have expanded House, but it would also mean that you'd more likely see your congressman, at the local bookshop, for instance. But it would also have the added effect, I should say, that it would, because remember how the Electoral College is selected. The Electoral College is, the numbers of each state gets assigned a number of electors based on the number of House members and the 2 senators from that state. If you increase the House of Representatives, more populous states would have greater representation in the Electoral College. So in a way, I think it has that knock-on effect, but I think the primary point is to address the concern.
But if I can add just one thing, if I could, I'm sorry. But if you look at it, you have the state reps, you have the state senators, you have the city council. People don't see them out there either. And the Democratic Party and the Republican, they're so corrupt. I mean, the whole network of raising money and ads and all that, they don't want to engage in the people. So, we got to look in the mirror and we got to blame ourselves because we're not engaging, because we're not organizing, we're not, engaging out there. So of course the government programs won't go to the people that need it because they're so disengaged. It's just a cycle.
So, a lot there. Some of which I agree with, some of which I would respectfully say a different perspective on. But what I would say is, look, from somebody that's spent 8 years in the House of Representatives, there are members that kill themselves every day, right? Down in DC, back here, oftentimes the criticism is, in fact, we're not spending enough time in Washington anymore, so you can't build up the relationships to build the bipartisanship to pass the bills. And so, look, to some extent, the fact that people have different perspectives and different ideas of the solutions means that it's not to say it's the right balance, but it's to say that, when everybody's mad at you to some extent, you're kind of in the middle, right? I knew folks that benefited from the power of incumbency tremendously and didn't do anywhere near the representative work that they should do. I saw folks that were back hustling every weekend. Political power is not uniform in this state either. You want to win a statewide election, you're going to focus on the suburbs within 128, right? Lawrence, Pittsfield, Fall River, New Bedford. The amount of times, in an audience like Brookline, when I was in office, if I asked an audience how many of you have been to Europe in the last 12 months versus how many of you have been to Fall River, Massachusetts in the last 12 months, a lot more hands for the former than the latter. But then a question of, you're so disconnected, I was in Fall River 4 times a month. Most folks from Brookline weren't. And if you're telling me that, gosh, you're disconnected from what the perspective on Brookline is, I got in this fight all the time. They would have, Brookline Solar Choice for renewable energy out here. Great. People want renewable energy here. Fantastic. Energy costs aren't the driving costs of doing business in Brookline. They are the driving costs of doing business in Fall River. You want me to advocate for a statewide policy? I'm about to put every small business out of business in Fall River. So let's think through what that implication. That doesn't mean I'm anti-climate change. It means that there's a different perspective that we have to have, given the fact that the constituents that I represent is bigger. Now, shrink that down. That solves part of that problem. It doesn't solve the polarization problem unless you gerrymander. Right. And so I don't think there's one silver bullet that's going to get to all of these things. So
15 silver bullets.
Yes, and one of them that I think, sir, you hit on without identifying it is, and this is a structural issue across the board, it's the powers of incumbency that make it such that it's very hard to have some of these competitive elections. And I have no issue with term limits. Nancy Pelosi should stay there for as long as she wants to be. But as long as somebody is willing to go through the rough and rumble of what a congressional cycle is. And when you're getting by on the fact that no one else can really challenge you because you've been there forever, that's a challenge. Somebody else. Yeah.
What about third parties?
What about third parties?
Yeah, so learning from other democracies, we're one of only a handful of democracies that have two-party systems. And that's not an argument for voting for a third party. It's an argument for changing the rules, because we have a system in which single-member districts, congressional districts, is a set of rules that are biased towards two parties. What most democracies do is have what's called multi-member districts, where each congressional district will have multiple members from that district. And so what that does is it provides an incentive for voters to vote for multiple parties, as well as for candidates to run for office under the banner of different parties. And so, these are what often called proportional representation systems. And so, most democracies began with single-member districts like we had, or began at least the 20th century with single-member districts like we had. But most democracies over the course of the 20th century introduced various forms of proportionality to increase the number of parties. And so, there's downside. It's not a silver bullet. I mean, there's downsides. There's concerns about fragmentation. It's hard to form coalitions and so on. But the upsides, I think, are pretty clear, that you have greater, it increases competition. It increases representation. People feel like they're really represented. And the same kind of negotiations that take place now, like in a primary process where you have different factions within the Democratic Party, take place at the level of forming governments, when you have multiple parties who then can form governments. And so, we make the case for that. And that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but actually there's signs of kind of change happening. So there's ranked choice voting, which a lot of people know about, is being advocated for, exists in Alaska, it exists in Maine. Is kind of form of voting that's sort of on the way to multi-party systems. I brought my group of my students to the Lexington town meeting where they introduced ranked choice voting. So this is something that's happening in Massachusetts, even at the local level. And I think these kinds of reforms would ultimately improve our democracy.
Yeah. Beth.
So you've talked about what our next president can do and some things that Congress can do, but what are some things that you specifically think that we can do? And also, I love both of your books. I read them both like a total geek. Underline them all.
Great.
So
Active reading, as they call it. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know other way.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank you.
writing both of them.
Yeah, well, people often ask this question, especially in blue areas, right? I think there's, at a very simple level, of course, voting is important, but I think actually, coming to events like this and encouraging other people to do this and engaged citizenry, I mean, it's easy to underestimate the power of that. When you think about, dictators around the world, the thing that they're most afraid of are majorities, right? I mean, the power of people to turn out to vote and to organize. So these kinds of things are really crucial, and they're not to be underestimated. I also think paying attention at the local level really matters a lot, because that's sort of where this begins. And so I live in Newton, and it's a highly educated, politically engaged community. I walk my dog in the evening, walk by homes, and people are watching MSNBC, shouting at the television. But then it turns out there's like 25% voter turnout in local council elections. And this comes to this point about this kind of, and so you might think, well, this is just the local level. This is so far from our national politics. But this shapes the nature of our congressional elections. This shapes the nature of our state legislative elections. So I think, we have to act where we are. Of course, I think being engaged, I guess one other point I would make is that I think one of the roots of this is the sort of decline of local newspapers, local public sphere, in a sense, that we don't sort of know what's happening in our communities. And so in any way that you can contribute to that, I think that really plays a part.
I've got a response for you, man, but I'll be quick on this, and then we're supposed to be done at 8, so we'll take a couple questions, but we'll be real quick on the answers. Democracy requires, I do not have a PhD, but I ran for Congress. Democracy requires some level of equity when it comes to political power. Our country does not have that at the moment. It is easy from the left. I represented, I had the privilege of obviously representing Brookline for years. I spent a lot of that time running around the country trying to get candidates elected in places in swing seats so that Democrats could have power in the House or the Senate and we could execute an agenda. What I didn't wholly understand was the enormous privilege that we have in a place like Brookline, where if you want to talk about women's rights or climate or foreign policy in sub-Saharan Africa, there is some expert here in this place right now that knows that. There isn't in Mississippi. There isn't near that civic infrastructure and architecture in Oklahoma. There's a lot less of that in Fall River and New Bedford than there is in Brookline and Newton. And so the reason why you've seen in the Boston Globe of late saying no one challenged our state legislators, our state legislators, because political power isn't equal here either. You want to run for statewide office, you're going to focus on where the people are and where the voters, what is going to motivate and animate a voter turnout in essentially a Democratic primary election, because at the moment a Republican primary electorate is not likely to win, or a Republican nominee is not likely to win a statewide election here in this state. But it means that those civic engagement muscles in those places like a Fall River or New Bedford or a Lawrence or Pittsfield or Lowell, they don't get anywhere near the investment that they otherwise might because it's not competitive. And because they don't have a robust community that has disposable income to reinvest back in it. And so our democracy here ends up getting concentrated in wealthier, highly educated communities that turn out, and that's great. They've got a perspective, that's wonderful. But it's not necessarily one that then has an equitable distribution of that political power the way in which we think about it, because we're a blue state and we celebrate democracy. And you see the consequence of that in Technicolor. When I started an organization that's doing some of this long-term organizing work in the, called Groundwork, but Groundwork Project, in the plains, the Deep South and Appalachia, we're in Mississippi, Alabama, West Virginia, Oklahoma. You try to see what's around to do this in rural Oklahoma, Mississippi, like Jackson, yes, Biloxi, a little bit. Very hard to do. Where was Roe overturned from? Mississippi. Where was the Clean Air Act overturned from? West Virginia. Where was voting rights challenged again and again? Alabama. Where was freedom of religion for education challenged? Oklahoma. There's a reason why they're doing it in these places.
I know we want to get to other questions, but one other thing I would say is that if you're frustrated by the absence of institutional reform, or it seems like it's a difficult thing, I mean, the way that stuff happens is people talking about these reform ideas. And so public conversations and engaging, and so that when the moment does arise, whether it's January 2025, to push for reform proposals, these ideas have to be there. People have to be talking about them, because otherwise, it's sort of, the first kind of the quickest way to a defeat of an idea is to not even talk about it. And so I think talking about these reform ideas and being engaged in discussions about this are really critical.
We're going to take the last two questions at once, 1 and 2. Ma'am.
Okay, my first question was going to be, before you talk, how do you define democracy? But you defined it a little bit. But to me, I look at democracy. Democracy, the base is the people, right? So it's all these people here. And what is missing is the connection of those people amongst each other and with what the hell are the political issues. Where as a quasi-American, because I'm from Puerto Rico, I understand Americans do not want to talk to each other. There are two topics you don't touch, right? How much you make and politics. You don't discuss those two because you're gonna have a fight. So there has to be a way in which it's not anymore about how you look, how you dress, what you said, a la Trump, but to break down what the real issues are. It's based on education, access to education.
We need a question mark, ma'am.
Okay.
You're asking a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Did you address that issue
Okay.
of breaking down what the issues are that people are supposed to be for or against?
And then, sir, you had a question. We're just giving them both at once so we can finish, so he can actually sell some books.
The split ticket voting, how is that just part and parcel of denationalizing politics and making more, both political parties more competitive in more states than the Senate we have now with the electoral college.
With its-
Can you
Uh,
repeat
so,
the
I mean,
question?
how-
It was hard to hear.
Okay.
How do we increase, because that seems on the decline of the 2 Senate races
I
everyone's
see.
talking about, how do we sort of reverse that and get voters, for whatever reason, choose, one party and then another?
How do you re-incentivize to put ticket voting?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so just first on what democracy, certainly democracy is ruled by the people, that's what it means, and when I talk about these 3 pillars, and I'll repeat them again, participation, competition, civil rights, these are mechanisms to make our government accountable
You
to
have to
people.
have active citizens.
Yeah, of course,
You don't
of
have
course.
active citizens.
Yeah, of course. But we need mechanisms to increase, these are the mechanisms, these are the tools that we have. And, I guess the question at some level that you're asking is about bipartisanship, and polarization. At some level, the increase in polarization. I guess my view is that, before November 2024, when one party, I encourage, in any democracy, I encourage people to not vote for authoritarians. And so, bipartisanship has its purposes, but it presumes that you have candidates who are committed to the democratic game. And so people can vote obviously for whoever they want, but I think it's, as a citizen and as a politician, you need to kind of draw a hard line and say you're not going to vote for candidates who don't accept election results and who endorse violence. It's a very simple litmus test. And if more people did that, we'd be much better off.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving the professor a huge hand.